I have with me today Naomi Kahn, Director of Regavim's International Division. And I'm Maayan Hoffman, Executive Editor at ILTV, and I welcome you back to the ILTV News Podcast. And welcome to you.
Thank you.
So, Naomi, I want to start with this big picture. Regavim just put out a report that is looking into, it's an investigation into what we call settler violence. Tell me about the report. Why put it out now?
Well, we put it out as soon as we felt that we had a good enough grasp on the data. A bigger question is why we're involved in this issue to begin with. Several years ago, we began to see the settler violence campaign is not new. It's quite old, as a matter of fact. We've been tracking how incidents on the ground are reported. Because of what Regavim does, we're dedicated to Israel's land, protecting Israel's land resources. So we're out in the field all the time. And we see illegal construction that becomes illegal outposts that become the hot points, the flash points of this quote-unquote settler violence narrative. So we began to see a preponderance of incidents in illegal outposts that were being reported as violent Jewish settlers from Judea and Samaria attacking innocent villagers. Now, these aren't villagers, and we know that they're not villagers, but we wanted to know what was at the base of these reports of violence. So we began to look into it, and slowly but surely, we began to understand that this narrative was very, very carefully constructed, curated evidence, paid actors, and very, very anti-Israel forces all at work to create a narrative that suddenly, just before and after the outbreak of the war on October 7th, 2023, took off. And this narrative now is having massive ramifications for Israel on the international stage and is causing a massive schism inside Israeli society. So as soon as we felt that we could release our analysis of real data, which is the only thing that we concern ourselves with, real data, we released the report.
And I know it's called False Flags and Real Agendas, which really plays to what you were just discussing. I'm sure that also had what to do with the Biden sanctions, the sanctions against settlers under the Biden administration, where they were saying that there is an increase or an uptick in settler violence, and therefore they wanted to sanction people who were allegedly causing this violence. So let's dissect the data a little bit, because I think, as you said, real data should be what we speak to. So you found, and I'm just going to read this, that 98% of incidents labeled as quote-unquote settler violence involved no Israeli civilians at all. So walk me through how you arrived at such a number.
So first of all, how we got our data. We had to do almost a James Bond kind of operation to get data from the main source that is feeding the United States government as well as other governments, and that is the United Nations. The United Nations runs what they call a dashboard of violence in Judea and Samaria and the occupied Palestinian territories, as they call it. And this dashboard has massive numbers. It breaks it down in certain ways: Palestinian casualties, Palestinian fatalities, Israeli casualties, Israeli fatalities, and by region. And it also allows you to filter out who the perpetrators are. So in many, many cases, what they'll call settler violence by Israeli civilian perpetrators were reported, and we did not know what to do with that information. So if you look at the dashboard.
They were reported? I'm sorry, I don't understand.
They simply appear on this dashboard.
We don't know who they.
Hundreds of numbers. So on the dashboard, there are several explanations, which already began to ring alarm bells. On the dashboard of the United Nations database, it says who is considered if a Palestinian casualty or fatality. It includes people who were killed or injured in the act of carrying out acts of terror against Jews.
Oh, wow.
So we saw that and we said, we need to look into this a little further. There was no way of knowing this from the dashboard itself, other than its explanation, how many of these incidents were included. So we asked the United Nations. It says, click here for the full data set. So we clicked and they said only vetted humanitarian organizations can have that data. And we said, okay, how do you become a vetted humanitarian organization? And they said, well, we decide. So in other words, they weren't giving out the data. They weren't telling us what it was based on. we did a kind of a James Bond thing and worked with someone who, from the outside, a foreign researcher in criminology who approached the United Nations for her research, asked for the database, and she received it. And she received 10 years' worth of data. She asked to go back a little further as well, and they began to get suspicious and stopped answering her emails. But she shared with us all the data that she got from the United Nations itself. And that's where the fun begins.
So now again, the 98% incidents that are labeled as settler violence but do not involve Israeli civilians.
Correct. So they either don't involve violence, or they don't involve Israeli civilians, or they didn't happen in Judea and Samaria, or all of the above. And I'll give you a lot of examples.
Well, give me one example.
One example is every single time a Jew goes up to the Temple Mount with a police escort and a completely peaceful visit, as allowed by law, it is listed as settler violence. It's called storming Al-Aqsa every single time.
Wow.
Yeah. Every traffic incident in Area C, the area of Judea and Samaria under Israeli jurisdiction, every traffic incident involving a Palestinian and a Jew, such as one that I was involved in, is listed as settler violence.
If you have a car accident?
Yes. And it doesn't matter who was at fault or who was hurt or what the circumstances were. Every car accident is listed as settler violence. So you can have a Palestinian worker who's working in a Jewish community. We have instances in the report, bitten by a dog. That's considered settler violence. They're writing all sorts of things, and that's just the incidents that actually did happen. We found hundreds and hundreds of things that simply didn't happen, and hundreds of reports of things that were called violence that involved things like the government of Israel laying a new road in Area C. That's considered trespass on Palestinian land. No violence, no settlers, no casualties, no fatalities. Settler violence.
So in reality, how many incidents of settler violence were there actually in this 10-year period?
So it's very hard for us to say precisely, and that's part of the problem and part of the recommendations of our report. We demanded, first of all, from the Israel police and from the Shabak, which, of course, the Shabak didn't answer us, but the Israel police, we had to actually file a Freedom of Information petition, and we received data from them. So it can take years to figure out whether or not these things were actually acts of violence. Someone files a report. It can take 1.5 years to 2 years to decide whether or not that file goes on to investigation, and from there to indictment, and from there to either conviction or not, in most cases. So it takes there's quite a lag, which accounts for some of the discrepancies in the data that you'll see when you read the report. The police will report that they investigated, for example, in 2024, over
I actually have a
191 incidents that they opened files for. 90 of them were false claims, and the commissioner of the police, there were no actual investigations launched because there was no incident. So actually, the commissioner of the Israel police testified in the Knesset that they find in any of the last 3 years, over 70% of the complaints filed are false. They are filed from people sitting in Tel Aviv in anti-Israel nonprofit offices, and they're filing complaints about violence that never occurred. So that's right off the bat. But the ones that there was some sort of confrontation, when the Israel police open a file, they have to see if there were Israeli civilians involved, if it was actually a confrontation. And this is the bulk of the material. What we found was that the bulk of these confrontations, 98% or more, involved Israeli security forces. So it was clashes between either the IDF or the police, but generally the IDF in Judea and Samaria, and Arabs, and had nothing to do with civilians, settlers, or violence on the part of Israelis at all.
So I actually wrote down some of the data because I do think that the numbers are actually a bit confusing to understand. So the report is very, very long. Yeah. It's about 65, 75 pages.
125.
125. I don't know why I'm thinking 65, 75 because this I'm looking at on page 57 of the report. It was that according to the Israeli police, between 2014 and 2024, so that's a 10-year period, there were a total of 537 investigation files that were opened against suspects on the basis cases of Jewish nationalist motivated crime in Judea and Samaria. So that was one bucket. Correct. Now, if I'm doing the math correctly, which you'll have to tell me if I'm not, it is still around more than 50 incidents that are being investigated a year for nationally motivated crimes. That does seem like a lot, nonetheless. Yes. And my question is, first of all, is that really a lot? And then second, what happened with these investigations? Did any of them lead to sentencing? And if not, why not?
Okay, so there's quite a lot of the report is dedicated to answering those precise questions. First of all, take into account that files opened by the police for nationalist motivated crime include also things like graffiti and incidents where there were no casualties or fatalities on the Arab side of any kind.
That doesn't make it right.
Of course not. But we're talking about settler violence. Right. Graffiti should not be put in the same bucket as someone throwing a Molotov cocktail into a bedroom where there are sleeping children.
Correct.
There are big differences.
Yes.
Now, what I should have said at the outset and what I didn't say and what's important to say and stress is that we have never claimed that there is no settler violence. We have never claimed that there is no violence among the Jewish population of Judea and Samaria.
Well, there's violence among every population.
Every human population on earth has a certain amount of violent behavior in it. And we actually took the statistics and tried to measure them against violence in the rest of Israeli society, nationwide. And what we found was that the Jewish population of Judea and Samaria is the least violent population in the country. And we found also that the Jewish population in Judea and Samaria is the victimized by Arab violence hundreds of percent more than anyone else. We also found that enforcement against Jewish nationalist or Jewish crime in Judea and Samaria is way over, percentage-wise, it's dozens or even hundreds of percent more than enforcement against Arab nationalist crime in Judea and Samaria. And we found that the rate of indictment, the rate of investigation and investigation is higher because there were more cases filed, more complaints filed, but indictments were much, much lower because so many of these are false claims or so many of them were found to have been self-defense when Jews were being attacked by Arab terrorists.
So I have to just ask, though, with regards to, and maybe this is not this is a silly question, and you'll tell me, but with the way that the law works in Judea and Samaria, so the Israel police are investigating, I'm assuming, the settler violence or the Jewish people, but wouldn't the IDF or the military be investigating the Arab crime, so it would be a very different system also?
Correct, and that's part of the problem. So what you'll see is the data that we have, for example, from the civil administration versus the data that we have from the Israel police, they're almost unrelated.
Right, which is what I also found, because between 2014 and 2024, according to, I think it was maybe the military, you'll correct me, they had 1,356 cases of Jewish nationalist motivated violence that were opened versus, as I said before, the 537 that the police were reporting. So that's a very big difference.
Correct.
And I don't understand, why are there such different numbers? How can you, for the same exact incidents?
That's correct. So what we find is these terrible discrepancies, which is part of the reason why we published this report. I think falsehood and this false narrative has been allowed to grow specifically because there is no transparency of the data. The Israel police does not release this information. The IDF certainly does not release this information. None of the Israeli authorities felt that it should be publicized, that there is violence among this community. So they kept quiet, and they allowed the other side to pump out a narrative of massive and growing violence that simply isn't true. We wanted to force the government of Israel to publicize the actual facts, to see what's really out there. If it's really out there, and we are not the ones to decide, but if it's really out there, what do we do about it? And if it isn't out there, why aren't we doing anything about that narrative? So that's a very big part of why we published the report. And one of our main recommendations is transparency. There's an old American saying, I'm sure I'm misquoting it, but that is that the worst enemy of good is perfect. I think it was unpleasant and uncomfortable for the state of Israel to admit that there is violence in this population or in any Israeli population, and so preferred to keep the lid on it and to hide it and to simply deal with it, in back channels and quietly. They're dealing with it extremely aggressively, unfortunately, sometimes too aggressively, as we've seen over-enforcement and the admissions that came out about Israel's Secret Service simply arresting Israelis and holding them in administrative detention with no suspicions even, but simply because they needed to show numbers and they wanted to shake up that community. So we've had a serious blow to Israel's democratic process, to Israel's democracy in general. But again, hiding the actual numbers, even if they're unpleasant, is not a good idea.
100%. Now, I do want to bring up the idea figures about the Arab population, because I do think that as I mentioned, more than 15 incidents a year, whether it's accurate, inaccurate, close to accurate, it still feels like a lot of incidents.
Yes.
But then when you hear the Arab figures, it actually feels kind of small, because what I found in the report that you put out was 24,808 stone throwing and Molotov cocktail incidents alone. Mm-hmm. That's excluding shootings, excluding explosive devices. Mm-hmm. That's by Arabs against the Jewish population, and that's only between not even 2014 and 2024, but 2019 and 2022. And if you look at again, the police, they look lower because they're at like 9,780. Right. But still, when you take 9,780 over like a 4-year period versus, again, the 500 and some odd the police are saying over a 10-year period, it starts to become a striking difference.
Yes. So the truth of the matter is that neither of those figures is reliable.
Okay.
Because they are self-filtering. These figures don't reflect incidents in which there were no casualties or damage.
Okay.
They don't reflect the violence that the Jewish communities are exposed to or are subjected to on a daily basis, unless the incident actually resulted in someone needing medical attention.
So in other words, if I throw a rock, God forbid, but at your car,
yes.
and I don't hit you because I don't have good aim,
it didn't
not recorded.
happen.
It didn't happen.
Correct.
Wow.
The fact that I had to swerve off the road and possibly hit something or get the scare of my life and be afraid to ever get back behind the wheel, or that my children were exposed to that incident and are terrorized, or all of those things, that's a given. That's just the way life is. But what we did was we took reports that are collated by first responders on the ground, and they report every incident to which they receive a call. And
they have to.
They have to. And those incidents include ones that were not successful. They'll say on it, no injuries, or they'll say only property damage. And all of those things are not reported in the official Israeli government apparatus for reporting. Anything that resulted without physical bodily harm to Israelis is not calculated.
Why would Israel want to reduce the number, though? It seems kind of contrary if we wanted to make the narrative stronger for Israel's side.
It's not just it's a very serious question that I think the members of the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria themselves grapple with. If you start to publish that you're living essentially in an impossible situation, that's going to make your communities first of all, more vulnerable. It will also encourage the other side to keep it up, and it will encourage people either to leave or not to move in, and then those communities will not grow, and it's a vicious cycle. Those communities then slowly but surely, they don't like to publicize these things themselves, but the truth is, they're happening. Now, whether people choose to live with that reality or not should be their choice. Whether the government of Israel should be protecting them in order to secure these communities is another question. But first and foremost, what Regavim is all about, and always has been all about, is let the facts speak. What are the facts? And in this case, the facts, it's a whole bundle, but this narrative has caused so much damage to the state of Israel, not just to the Jewish communities and to the image of Jewish quote-unquote settlers, but to the state of Israel as a whole. And that was the real point of this entire campaign.
Yeah.
So the campaign was created many years ago, and the banner of that campaign appears in black and white, actually in red and white, on the B'Tselem website, and that is settler violence equals state violence. The point of this whole campaign wasn't just to tarnish the reputation of the Jewish settlers. It was to create that link between the settlers and the IDF that are protecting them and are supporting their behavior. And then, by extension, to tarnish the reputation of the moral standing of the entire state of Israel. And that's exactly what this narrative has achieved, so that the Biden administration could say there's a massive wave of settler violence, which didn't happen, but the upshot of that is, and the second part of that same sentence was, the Israelis aren't doing anything about it. That means tarnishing the reputation of our entire judicial and enforcement system, and tarnishing the reputation of Israel as a democracy altogether. And all of that resulted in sanctions, not only against individual Israelis, but against civil society organizations, and it resulted in arms embargoes in a time of war. And these are big picture issues, not just are the people living in this particular Jewish community in Judea violent or not violent. And that was the point of this campaign to begin with. It was never about those specific people.
Makes sense. I mean, now you say there is over-enforcement of Jews and there's under-enforcement of Arabs. And the examples you were giving, like, well, if we throw a rock but nothing happens, then we probably don't have enforcement as much as we don't have reporting. And I'm guessing, as you said, vice versa, there's administrative detention to somebody just to make quotas, and maybe they haven't actually done any crime. Mm-hmm. But why? It's politically motivated. Who's politically motivated to get this narrative out beyond B'Tselem, which is just, truthfully, just a very left-wing anti-Israel NGO.
Correct.
But there's not, that doesn't seem, it seems to me that B'Tselem is not enough of an answer.
Right. So the bigger answer is that it began when President Biden was first elected. The Prime Minister of Israel at the time went to meet the newly installed President of the United States, and the first topic of conversation in their first meeting was settler violence. And this is not a coincidence. He had very, very active advisors who were associated with B'Tselem and Peace Now and other leftist Israeli organizations for many years, sitting in his administration. So the first topic of conversation between Naftali Bennett, Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and Joe Biden, President of the United States, was settler violence. And President Biden said, you have a problem in this settler violence. And instead of saying either the coward's way out, I'll look into it, right, or the real answer, which is there is a small marginal amount of violence and we are dealing with it aggressively and investing tremendous resources to prevent it, to educate against it, to apprehend those involved, and to try and incarcerate them if necessary. Instead of all of that, what did Naftali Bennett say? He said, you're right, and we'll have to do something about this. And so Naftali Bennett went back to Israel, and he created a forum of all of the heads of Israel's security apparatus who convened for weekly meetings to report on what they were doing about settler violence. Wow. Now, this is when all these administrative detentions and all these other over-enforcement became necessary, because if you're meeting once a week and you have to report on what you're doing to the president,
something. That's
so
right.
do something. So even if nobody's done anything, you have to start rounding people up and holding them in detention and issuing orders that they're not allowed to go back to their homes or see their families or anything, so that you can have something to report back to the Prime Minister, who will then report back to the President.
But Naomi, I want to stop you, though, for a minute, because there is some settler violence. And as you said, it might be a very small percentage. But it does feel sometimes, maybe it's media, maybe it's how it's being reported, that it's not really properly being addressed or even looked at that seriously. Because just like we would say no murder is okay in Israeli society, obviously you're not going to necessarily eradicate it, but you wouldn't say, well, it's such a small percentage that get murdered. No, you would say, let's stop murder. So
Absolutely.
What do we need to do about the settler violence that does exist? Why would any settler think it's okay to go in and burn someone's car in a Palestinian village.
That is a tragedy. It is a crime. It shouldn't happen. And the number of times that it has happened in history, you can count on the fingers of one hand, and it shouldn't happen. And the people who are involved in that have been arrested, as they should have been. They have been tried, as they should have been. They have been incarcerated, as they should have been.
Is that correct? Because I feel like the numbers
Yes.
skew that there haven't been so many.
The number of people who have been involved in actual violence is small, not small enough. It should be zero. But take a step back. The claim that Israel isn't doing enough about it is very hard to support.
Okay.
If you look at the amount of resources, first of all, the government of Israel created an entire wing of the Secret Service to deal only with settler violence. Now, you're talking about a massive apparatus that is focusing on, a classroom full of people. That's about the size of it. Not a college
Waste
lecture
of
hall.
resources given the situation
it's huge.
in Israel.
So they go chasing around after their own tails, and they are arresting people and questioning people and bringing people in for questioning, et cetera, and giving them warnings, et cetera. Even when there's no crime involved, they just they don't like the look of them. In a lot of cases. In some cases, yes, it is justified to bring certain people in for questioning and to hold them so that they don't commit a crime. We have this concept of a ticking time bomb, and if you know of someone who's planning to do something bad, stop them before they do it. I'd also point out that the State of Israel has invested millions and millions in educational programs to educate against violence and against taking the law into your own hands. It has invested millions in re-educating or in creating alternative frameworks for teenagers who have dropped out of the system and are living on hilltops. It has, in addition, aggressively enforced construction against illegal construction on these hilltops. So Israel's really investing tremendous resources. Sometimes there's a boomerang effect. When you victimize a population and you stereotype them,
they play up to it.
They play up to it. They want to live up to it, and that's unfortunate. But Israel has invested millions and millions in this over years. I would point out also that on the other side, the Palestinian Authority has also invested millions and millions to encourage violence. They pay people to murder Jews. They pay people to attempt to murder Jews. They lionize them. They glorify them. They name schools and summer camps and village squares after people who have murdered Jews, and the more the better. They pay their families.
So let me ask you this, because we're gonna run out of time. And
yes.
You did mention in the report, which I think was a very strong statement, that this whole narrative that is going on is actually undermining Israeli democracy and weakening our national security. And it's a very scary time to hear something like that.
Yes.
Because of the issues of democracy in the country, but also because of the issues of security. We're 20 months after October 7th. We're still fighting Hamas. We've been engaged in a second front war. And all we hear is that Judea and Samaria is next. So, I mean, it's a very strong claim. Mm-hmm. Let's end by you just walking me through that connection and what has to change.
So I think the recent revelations of illegal arrest of Israelis in order to fulfill these quotas and to live up to the task that was given to this whole apparatus to fight settler violence is the first step in undermining democracy. When you talk about prejudicial enforcement and over-enforcement, what you're essentially talking about is a non-democratic process. We believe at Regavim in every sphere that we're involved in, and this is not one of our main areas of activity, in equal and universal enforcement of the law. But unequal enforcement of the law is not enforcement of the law. It's politicization of the law. So that undermines Israel's democracy to begin with. Also, the generation of this narrative and feeding this narrative to our allies and enemies abroad has essentially undermined Israel's judiciary, its police, its entire apparatus for enforcement and upholding of the law. That's a very frightening thing. When the United States says Israel's judicial system is not functioning, we have a very serious problem. Yeah. And allowing this narrative to have been pushed out without pushing back is a huge mistake on the part of the Israeli government that we're hoping that this report will push them to correct.
Amazing. So thank you so much, because I think this is, we said, a very long report, a report that needs to be unpacked, needs to be read really by not only the people of Israel, but by the diplomatic partners that we have around the world to helpfully debunk the narrative that you said is spreading so massively around. So Naomi Kahn, Director of Regavim's International Division, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you.